Hey, let's talk about my draft map of my setting. Just a little bit of context. I've been tinkering with this stuff for a long time, and I had 3 areas that were not necessarily connected. They weren't necessarily initially envisioned as part of the same setting at all, but I decided that I wanted the 3 of them to become the core, if not even, for that matter, the entirety. Other than a few throwaway names for reference that are beyond the map. But this would be the entirety of my new setting, would be these 3 areas that all came from what were originally 3 separate developments on my end. So I needed to redraw my map, and I needed to squeeze it all in, all 3 of these areas. And that meant, of course, that I was going to have to warp and mangle and rearrange considerably to get it all to fit. And I had kind of thought that maybe I would do a YouTube video where I showed myself actually drawing this draft, and I decided not to, in part because I felt like waiting around while I tried to figure out how I would actually set that up was keeping me from just going ahead and doing it. So anyway, here is the map of the setting. I'm going to show both the whole thing, and then I'm going to show some of the 3 constituent parts, or the stuff that belong to the 3 constituent parts, and how they kind of now work together. And I'm going to talk very briefly about them. This map is deliberately a draft. I just got a piece of scratch paper. It was an old kind of beat up piece of typing paper that had been sitting in a backpack, and a ballpoint pen, and just kind of started drawing stuff until I had an arrangement here. You'll see that my drawing style and my handwriting both is extremely sloppy. There's a couple places where I have changed the names and I just crossed it out and wrote a new one. I mean, this is not meant to be a final version at all. It is not my intention that it ever was. A lot of people like to draw with pencil and then trace over it with ink. I actually don't like doing that. I just always kind of prefer drawing with ink. Of course, that means that I kind of need to know what I'm doing ahead of time, so I thought it made sense to do a draft, and it was my intention that I was going to move from this draft to the final copy. I think I will actually have an intermediate draft that maybe looks a little better than this one, just because the simple reason that after I did this, I kind of feel like a lot of the features are too similar in size and shape to each other, and I need to either kind of stretch some of them out, make them different shape, different form, or different size. Some of them kind of need to shrink a little bit. Maybe they don't need to be as big. Some of them need to grow. Some of them actually, due to the nature of the draft, they are kind of meant, they're going to look a little different. I already know how they're going to look different. But anyway, I think I'm going to do an intermediate draft, and that's unusual for me too, but I'm actually really kind of serious about wanting my final version of this to look like probably one of the best maps that I've ever drawn, at least. So I'm going to really take my time making everything look as nice as it can. My calligraphy is certainly a limitation, so I'm not even going to write any of the feature names in. I'm going to draw the final version without any labels, and then I'm going to add the labels in digitally after the fact, just because it will look a lot better. So that's kind of what I'm going to do. Let's have a quick look at the map, will we? Let's start over here in the northwest corner. This is the portion of the map that is based on my old Bail Hamazi area. Bail Hamazi was a name that I invented way back when 4E was announced. 4th edition D&D was announced, but hadn't yet come out. And they had talked about this ancient tiefling empire called Baal Turath, or however exactly you pronounce it. I decided I liked the idea, but I didn't want to use their name. I didn't want to use their version of tieflings, but I did want to have a nation of kind of a cursed, demon worshipping kind of people, or at least former demon worshipping people. Their empire had kind of fallen apart and was now, and I didn't make this the way that D&D did, because I didn't even know what D&D was going to do yet. It had barely just been announced. So I decided that the empire had kind of fallen apart, and it was kind of like Alexander the Great's empire, when there were a bunch of different constituencies. Many of them were little more than minor city-states, but some of them controlled a portion of the empire. A lot of them, the former slaves, had risen up in rebellion against them. The spaces between the city-states were often, filled with savages that were, loosely based on a conglomeration of, the Apaches, the Comanches, the Huns, the Scythians, the Mongols, or whatever. And they were all kind of, merged together in this melange of, dangerous raiding savages that made travel between the city-states very difficult. And that was kind of what Baal Hamazi originally was. I later, as I was tinkering with kind of remixing and reusing some Eberron elements, I'd always kind of been caught up. I liked the idea of the demon waste, but I didn't like a lot of its implementation. And so I'd kind of been playing around with that. I ended up borrowing quite a bit from my Baal Hamazi because in theme they were similar. And so that's really kind of what we have here. We have a geography that is loosely based on the demon wastes, but meanwhile the content within it is much more based on my own stuff that I had developed a number of years ago. I'm not entirely happy with all of this stuff. This draft was not just about putting things where they needed to go, although that was its primary purpose. But I also wanted to try and draw a few things on the map that I wasn't 100% sure how I was going to draw, so this is a little bit experimental. You can see the gorge lands, the Hamazin gorge lands, kind of right there in the middle of that, hammerhead-shaped peninsula. I don't love the way that turned out. It's close, but not quite what I want, and it's just a giant canyon that's got, a number of forks in it. There's also the Rudmont Escarpment. You can see that the elevation up on the peninsula, or at least where the peninsula meets the mainland, is considerably higher, and then it slopes down gradually to the sea. So there's supposed to be this big escarpment, and it's 1,000 feet higher or so. There's a big fault line that runs right there. And this huge escarpment is really steep on one side and then kind of a long, slow, gradual slope down the other side. I'm not 100% sure that I love how that turned out. Now, granted, this was just a sketch and a draft, but I'm going to need to play around with exactly how I'm going to draw that so I can make sure that I'm happy with it. Let's see. The other art thing that I'm not very sure of is if you look down here kind of at the boneyard, you can see that it's supposed to be a desert, I hope, but I'm not really in love with how it looks either, so I think that's something else I'm going to need to spend a little bit of time on. I did have more features than I could fit on the peninsula, so we spilled out over here a little bit onto the northern edge of the mainland, the Kindatu Mountains, Volek Zemenok, and the Pilar Lake. A few other features over here are not on the peninsula, but they kind of belong with Baal Hamazi, and that's okay. Like I said, I kind of wanted a more tightly sutured integration between the elements of the setting that I was borrowing from, rather than having them kind of be separate and just stuck next to each other. So I actually kind of like that it spills out a little bit into, what is material that originally belonged to the hill country. The boneyard also, I should mention, the boneyard was originally in the hill country. It is now considerably to the west of the hill country, and it's kind of separate from it. And it kind of is smack dab in the middle of the area between the three, and represents a major barrier, I guess. Now, of course, you can get from, Bale Hamazi to the hill country to Timishburg by going around the boneyard, and they're not unconnected, certainly, but you can't go in a straight line very easily because the boneyard is this desert full of people who have died, mostly the bodies of soldiers of past empires who have fought over the various territories, and this is the area where a lot of those battles were fought, and so that's kind of why they call it the boneyard, because there's literally a lot of bones there from past armies, but also because it is kind of a very inhospitable desert area, and it's relatively large. It's kind of featureless. I tried to put some stuff in there to make it look a little decorative, but it's supposed to be large and it's supposed to be featureless. That's kind of the whole point, a little bit, right? Let's go down here and look at Timishburg. Timishburg was something that I initially came up with as I wanted to kind of do a more horror-themed dark fantasy game, and I had called that Cult of Undeath, and it was kind of loosely based on one of the Pathfinder adventure paths that takes place in their kind of pseudo-Transylvania part of the setting. Of course, I wanted to not only do some serious modification to the adventure path and just kind of, cherry pick some ideas out of it, but I also wanted to do the same thing with their setting and kind of do my own take on what a horror setting was like. And I had something else kicking around again from years ago, and the high concept of it was that it was a country where much of the aristocracy was vampiric. They were vampires. And although they weren't necessarily super secretive about that, and it's supposed to be kind of obvious, at least to us from a meta standpoint, you look at that and you're like, oh, well, those are obviously vampires. I mean, for crying out loud, they got names like Dracul and Orlok and Nosferatu. So it's supposed to be pretty obvious that they're vampires, but not necessarily everybody in the setting or even everybody in the kingdom believes that there really are vampires ruling it, because they're kind of just secretive enough. It's a little bit like some of these conspiracy theories in real life that, as evidence builds up, it's actually not necessarily unlikely that they're completely true, but you don't quite have the proof and you don't quite have total mainstream acceptance of it yet. That's kind of where we are with this. This map was developed a little bit differently, and I had a lot of kind of regions that didn't necessarily have a lot of features in them, like these different counties. I'm not sure that I necessarily need all those labels, although I do kind of like them, so I think I'll probably use them. Not only do we have, these towns and cities that are obviously meant to, kind of look like a fantasy Transylvania, there's a few Lovecraftian nods in here as well. You'll see up here, for example, there's the city of Inganok that is kind of nestled here on the coast by these onyx peaks. That's on purpose. Hopefully that's something that rings a bell if you've read your H.P. Lovecraft. And then down here further south in the tidal swamps, we have Innsboro, which is, hopefully it's obviously Innsmouth. It's not or Innsmouth. I don't know how you pronounce it. But so that's obviously kind of a riff on that same idea as well. If you ever are unfortunate enough to visit that town, get out before dark unless you want to be attacked by fish people kind of thing, right? And then we've got the Bitterwood and the Virco Lodge, which is famous for being a forest that's frequented by werewolves, and You've got Mittermarkt, which is kind of a, I don't know, I don't remember the name of the town. It's been years since I read the book, but it's kind of where, Frankenstein developed his monster outside of there. It's kind of a, there's a whole lot of different things that are borrowed from various horror genre properties and ideas and concepts, and they're all kind of stuffed in here. And that's how Paizo did it with their Ustalav country, which is, I want to say, their Ustalav setting. It's not a whole setting. Although, curiously, the Pathfinder setting by Paizo, it really could be considered separate, discrete settings that are just kind of put together patchwork fashion. I don't think you're necessarily meant to go gallivanting across the entire setting. I think you're supposed to kind of stay focused in the area of the setting that fits the tone of the game that the game master's trying to run for you. So, if you're doing kind of this horror theme stuff, then you probably stick in Ustalav and you don't get up and go, next door to Galt or whatever country's next door, which is the French Revolution setting, because there'd be a major break in tone. So it's kind of interesting that I think that Pathfinder, although it's one setting, it's really kind of a bunch of separate settings that just happen to be tied together just in case you need to move from one to the other between chapters or whatever. Obviously I've got here kind of this demonic person-themed portion of the setting, and then I got this vampire theme. I've always been kind of a dark fantasy fan, and my setting is supposed to have plenty of elements from that. But, the other half of the setting, the eastern half, on the other side of the mountains here, is it's a little bit less overt, and this is kind of the so-called hill country, and this is kind of the Anglo-Saxon. It's kind of a melange of Robin Hood and Ivanhoe era England and late 1800s era Old West in America, and they're supposed to kind of be equal parts, same tone, I guess, a little bit. But there's two big city-states, Waychester up here on the Darkling Sea, and Dunsbury down here on the Chatterwash River. And those are kind of the two big regional powers in the hill country, and they're kind of rivals. The Grand Duke of Waychester has designs on the entire area of the hill country. He wants to kind of bring Dunsbury and all of its, satellite communities into its orbit. And then once he's got this big territory, proclaim himself a king. He wants a promotion, basically. Luckily for the people in the South, he's got an awful lot of drama and court intrigue going on in his own town. So although that's his ambition, he's not really in a position to do anything about it right now. His own wife is locked in a tower for treason, and she's got her supporters who are running around. There's all this stuff going on. So this is kind of more intrigue and skullduggery, as opposed to overt horror, although I kind of like the idea that the PCs would likely play something similar to, fantasy version of Mulder and Scully, and they would be the ones kind of running around in this territory chasing down supernatural threats. So they would have kind of more of a specific tie to the dark fantasy elements, and then the other half of the setting is more overtly dark fantasy by its very tone and the content in it. Let's see. Like I said, I think one of the things that I'm a little bit unhappy about with this draft is that too many of the features, they're kind of the same shape and size. I would like to redraw them slightly in an intermediate version of the map, and then it will be much closer to what the final version will look like. And hopefully when I draw that, I won't see the need to iron out too many more things beyond that. But even then, I'm quite happy with it, how this turned out. I mean, I knew that, I was a little worried about even fitting the material I have on a single map. I wasn't even sure I was going to be able to do it. So I think that this draft is proof of concept that it's doable. Now I just need to add an extra layer of polish to make it a little bit better. And from there, when I go from the intermediate version to the final version, I don't hope to actually change very many things. I just hope to make it look nicer. It'll be a prettier version of the same map. So I will be working in parallel on two different things. First off, I will be working on this intermediate version of the map. And I'll be doing that while I'm waiting. I ordered some specific art supplies, and I don't really have any anymore, although I used to in the past. I didn't have any good art pens. I didn't have any good sketch paper. I just was drawing with a gel pen or even a ballpoint pen on typing paper. And that's how I did it when I was a kid anyway. I've been drawing maps for a long time. Most of the style elements and the way I draw them goes back to, back when I was in 8th, 9th grade, back in the mid-'80s when Miami Vice was running on TV for the first time, and it's that old. And I don't want to say that I haven't made some refinements to my style and how I draw things, because I have. But most of the stuff really kind of dates back to then in terms of how I draw it. And a lot of it is extremely heavily influenced by especially the Christopher Tolkien maps that were included with Lord of the Rings. And I didn't like the way he did forests. I thought it was tedious, so I kind of found another version and some other map, and that's what I've done. Now, keep in mind that what you're looking at here on this map, this is extremely draft and sketchy. I don't actually draw stuff this way. This is the way I draw stuff when I'm in a hurry and I just want to try and block out where stuff is going to be, rather than when I want to actually make stuff look nice. Although, I gotta be honest with you, some of the stuff doesn't look tons different. And part of it too is that even if I'm trying to go fast and sketchy, in a lot of ways, I kind of subconsciously start to kind of revert to, like why did I put shading on my mountains and draw like shapes and stuff, as opposed to just making quick and dirty V's or upside down V's. So this isn't quite as sketchy as it could be, just because I subconsciously kind of start migrating towards my default style. But this was done fast and it was done sloppy. When I do my final version, it will look much nicer, is my intention, and it will be a much more pretty looking product in its own right. Something that I'll be happy to show people and say, look, here's my setting. And here I am happy to show you my draft, because I'm doing that, but this is meant to be a draft, and I don't expect that anybody looks at this map and says, oh, that's a cool looking map. But stay tuned. The real version, or at least the better version, the intermediate draft, will be coming soon, and within a few weeks at most, I'll have a final version ready to go. I haven't yet decided if I'm going to try and do a colorized version of it or not. I might, because if I'm going to do hybrid digitalization anyway, at least for the lettering, then I might as well create another layer with color and then sandwich it in between, the scan and the lettering, and then have it as at least an alternative version. So I probably will, but I don't know. I kind of like the black and white though, because that's what I grew up looking at, and that's every fantasy novel you ever get still has a black and white map in it, right? Because that's how they print fantasy novels. So I kind of like that look, and I might get stuck there and not move on from it, just because I think that once I do that, I'll probably be pretty happy with the product, and I may not want to keep tinkering with it. Anyway, stay tuned. More will come, and what will come will be better than what has already gone before.